The dust motes danced in the lone shaft of sunlight cutting through the greasy window of Mitch's apartment. He traced patterns on the grimy tabletop, his finger leaving a clean smear on the chipped formica. Another day, another stack of unpaid bills staring him down like hungry wolves. Life hadn't exactly delivered on the promises he'd made to himself back in his glory days, those days way back in Tupelo, Mississippi, when he'd ruled the school hallways like a king. He remembered those days vividly, too vividly sometimes. The way the smaller kids scattered when he walked by, the nervous glances, the whispered apologies. He'd reveled in it. Then the power, the control. He'd been big for his age, with a sneer that could curdle milk and a punch that could make a grown man wince. He thought he was untouchable. He thought that feeling would last forever. One face, though, always seemed to float to the surface of those memories clearer than the rest. A boy with big, dreamy eyes, a quiet way about him, and a shy smile that rarely got a chance to bloom. Elvis Presley? Yeah, that was his name. Mitchens frowned, dragging his finger through the dust, again smearing the clean spot he picked on Elvis. It wasn't even about anything specific, just the way Elvis was, quiet, a little awkward, always humming some tune Mitch couldn't quite make out. It made him a target, easy pickings. Mitch remembered tripping him in the hall, snatching his lunch, hiding his books. Petty stuff, but it had felt powerful at the time. Each act had made Mitch feel bigger, stronger, more in charge of his small world. He'd even punched Elvis once, a glancing blow enough to make his lip bleed. Elvis hadn't fought back. He just looked at Mitch with those wide, hurt eyes, then quietly walked away. Mitch had dismissed it. Then, another victory. Now, a cold knot formed in his stomach when he thought about those eyes. He stood up, stretching his aching back. He was a long way from Tupelo now, a long way from being anyone's king. He worked odd jobs, mostly manual labor. When he could find it, he lived hand to mouth, just barely scraping by. The power he'd once felt was long gone, replaced by a constant gnawing anxiety about the next meal, the next rent payment. He hadn't thought about Elvis Presley in years, not really. Not until lately it started subtly. A song on the radio while he was driving an old pickup for a moving gig. He'd barely paid attention at first, just a familiar tune. Then the voice hit him. That voice, smooth, powerful, unmistakable, and the name of the singer popped into his head like a forgotten dream. Elvis Presley. He'd almost laughed. Elvis Presley, the quiet kid from Tupelo. No way. But then he started seeing him everywhere. On magazine covers, in the grocery store, old movie posters outside a revival theater. Even a special on TV at a bar he sometimes went to for a cheap beer. The name was everywhere, whispered with reverence, shouted with adoration. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll. It was impossible the gangly kid he used to push around, the one who barely spoke above a whisper. But the more he saw, the more he heard, the more real it became. The eyes were the same, those deep-set, soulful eyes. Even if the face was now more chiseled, more confident, the slight smirk, the way he held himself on stage. It was all Elvis, his Elvis. The realization had hit him like a physical blow. The boy he'd tormented, the one he'd made feel small, had become this. A legend, a global icon. And Mitch, he was still just Mitch, struggling in a dusty apartment, haunted by shadows and the ghosts of his own past. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He walked over to the chipped radio on his nightstand and flicked it on. Static for a moment, then a familiar melody filled the air. Love Me Tender. Elvis's voice, soft and crooning, filled the small room, seeming to mock Mitch with its beauty and success. He stared at the faded wallpaper, a lump forming in his throat. What would Elvis say if he saw him now? Would he even remember? Mitch knew he would. Some hurts never faded. He'd done enough damage to ensure that. A shiver went down his spine despite the oppressive heat of the room. He imagined Elvis, draped in sequins, standing on a massive stage, thousands cheering for him. Then he imagined himself Mitch, the one who used to make Elvis. The thought was a knot of shame and a strange morbid curiosity. What if their paths crossed? What would happen then? He knew what he deserved: a cold shoulder, a glare, maybe even a punch. Could he ever look into those eyes again, the eyes he'd once made so sad? Possibility, however remote, was suddenly very real, and it filled Mitch with a mixture of dread and an unexpected, unsettling pull. He just knew deep down that their paths were destined to cross again. The universe had a strange way of settling old scores, and Mitch felt like his was long overdue. The king was coming to town. He'd heard it on the news, a major concert, and suddenly Mitch felt a strange, inexplicable urge to be there, not as a fan, but as something else, maybe a witness to his own reckoning. He walked to the window, pulling aside the torn curtains. The city hummed outside, unaware of the turmoil inside his small apartment. A billboard across the street glowed, advertising an upcoming event. Picture of Elvis, larger than life. His gaze powerful and intense. Mitch felt a chill, despite the summer heat. The king was indeed coming, and Mitch knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he had to be there. He just didn't know why or what would happen when he was. But the ghost of the past was about to become very, very real. The newspaper was old, crumpled, and smelled faintly of stale coffee. Mitch picked it up from the counter of the diner where he'd just finished a plate of lukewarm eggs and toast, the cheapest thing on the menu. He wasn't usually one to read the paper, but something caught his eye. A small ad tucked away on an inside page. Temporary, stagehand crew needed, major production. No names, no specific details, just a phone number and a vague location. The city's largest arena. Mitch's heart did a strange little flutter. He tried to dismiss it. It was probably for some boring play or a traveling circus. But then the billboard he'd seen earlier flashed in his mind. Elvis, larger than life, dominating the cityscape. King was indeed coming to town. And where else would he perform but the largest arena? A crazy idea began to form in his mind. A chance, however slim, to get close. Not as a fan, never as a fan, but perhaps just to see, to witness, to understand. Or maybe, just maybe, to prove to himself that the past was truly past, that the boy he'd known was gone, replaced by an untouchable icon, or perhaps to confirm that some part of that boy still existed, wounded and remembered. He tore out the ad and went to a payphone. His own landline had been disconnected weeks ago. His hands trembled slightly as he dialed the number. A gruff voice answered on the third ring. I saw you're it," Mitch stammered, feeling foolish already. "For stage crew. You got experience?" the voice asked, clearly impatient. Mitch racked his brain. Sure, plenty, moving stuff. Setting things up. Heavy lifting. I'm strong." He wasn't lying entirely. He'd moved furniture, boxes, even parts of old machinery. Stage equipment couldn't be that different, could it? "All right, we're short-staffed. Show up tomorrow. 7 a.m. sharp. Arena loading dock. Ask for Big Mike. Don't be late." And then the line went dead. Mitch hung up the receiver. A strange mix of exhilaration and dread bubbling inside him. He actually had a chance. An honest-to-goodness opportunity to be in the same building, perhaps even the same room, as Elvis Presley. The thought was both terrifying and oddly compelling. The next morning, Mitch arrived at the arena an hour early, his old pickup truck clanking as he pulled into the loading dock area. A few other guys were already there, smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee from styrofoam cups. He felt a nervous flutter in his stomach. This wasn't just any job. This was a collision course with his past. Big Mike was a mountain of a man with a booming voice and a perpetual frown. He assigned Mitch to a team hauling heavy crates of sound equipment. The work was brutal, relentless. Mitch grunted, strained, and sweated, his muscles protesting with every lift. But he pushed through it, a strange energy propelling him forward. He felt like a coiled spring waiting for something, though he didn't know what. He worked alongside a dozen other temporary hires, most of them rough-looking and focused only on getting through the day. No one talked much, just grunts and occasional curses. Mitch kept his head down, trying to blend in, trying not to draw attention to himself. He was just another faceless worker, a ghost among ghosts. Hours blurred into a grueling rhythm of lifting, carrying, and stacking the arena slowly transform. Cables snaked across the floor, spotlights were hoisted into the rafters, and the massive stage, still incomplete, began to take shape. Mitch caught glimpses of intricate stage designs, gleaming instruments and what looked like a dozen different microphones, all waiting for the voice that would fill this cavernous space. He heard whispers among the permanent crew, excited murmurs about the star. Crowds go wild for him. Best show in the world. Mitch just listened, a tight knot in his chest. Each word brought him closer to the reality of the situation. This wasn't just a concert. It was an event. And he, Mitch, was a part of it, even if just a tiny, insignificant cog in the massive machine. He was hauling a heavy flight case towards the backstage area when he saw a door slightly ajar, with a star on it. Not a fancy gold star, but a simple white paper one taped to the wood, with a name scrawled in black marker, E. Presley. Mitch froze the heavy case, digging into his shoulder. This was it. This was where he would be the king. A wave of nausea washed over him, followed by a strange, almost irresistible urge to push the door open to peer inside. He squeezed his eyes shut for a second, trying to regain control. He was just a stagehand. He had a job to do. He wrestled the flight case into place with a clatter that seemed deafening in the quiet hallway. He glanced at the door again, then quickly walked away, pretending to be busy arranging other equipment. His heart hammered against his ribs. He felt like he was back in that school hallway, just a step away from making a bad decision. But this time, the stakes felt so much higher as the day wore on. A general buzz started to fill the air. More people arrived. Roadies, musicians, security personnel, people in fancy suits. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation. Mitch felt like an outsider watching a world he didn't belong to. He was a shadow moving through the periphery, trying to stay unnoticed. Near dusk, a black limousine pulled up to a discreet side entrance. A ripple went through the small crowd of crew members who happened to be outside. Mitch, wiping sweat from his brow, watched from a distance. The back door opened and a figure emerged. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a confident stride. Even from afar, Mitch could feel the aura of power, of celebrity. It was him, no doubt about it. The way he carried himself, the slight tilt of his head, the way he seemed to command attention even before he'd fully stepped out of the car. It was Elvis. The Elvis Mitch felt his breath catch in his throat. He looked older, of course, more refined, but the core of him was still there. Those eyes, even from a distance, seemed to hold a world of experience, of melancholy, of quiet intensity. Mitch felt a sudden, profound shift. In his perception, this wasn't just a kid he pushed around. This was someone else entirely. Elvis, flanked by security, moved quickly towards the arena entrance. For a fleeting moment, as he turned slightly, his gaze swept across the loading dock area. A casual, impersonal glance. His eyes passed over Mitch, not lingering, not her face in the crowd. Mitch froze, his blood running cold. He felt a primal instinct to duck, to hide, to disappear, but he stood his ground, a silent, invisible observer. The moment passed. Elvis was gone, swallowed by the imposing doors of the arena. Mitch let out a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He was in. He was here. He had seen him, and Elvis hadn't seen him back, not really. The relief was immense, but it was quickly replaced by a new, unsettling feeling. He was close, closer than he'd ever imagined he would be, and the game, whatever it was, had just begun. The memory of the kid with the sad eyes clashed with the imposing figure who had just walked past him, and Mitch knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the confrontation he both dreaded and craved was now inevitable. He just had to wait for the right, or wrong, moment. The next day brought more of the same grueling work, but with an added layer of tension. Rehearsals were in full swing. Mitch could hear the muffled throb of the band through the walls, the distant wail of a guitar. He worked with a feverish intensity, trying to keep busy, trying not to think about the man who was now just rooms away. His job had shifted slightly. Instead of just hauling cases, he was now helping with stage setup, positioning microphones, moving monitors, and running cables. This meant he was on the main floor of the arena, sometimes even on the stage itself, albeit when it was mostly empty. He caught glimpses of the musicians, the backup singers, the road crew. Everyone seemed to move with a purpose. A quiet professionalism that Mitch found oddly compelling. This wasn't just a job for them, it was a passion, a well-oiled machine all focused on one thing, the performance. He was dragging a heavy speaker cable across the stage, his back protesting. When he heard a voice, it was speaking softly, giving directions. Mitch didn't recognize the words at first, just the low timbre, the distinct rhythm. And then he saw him. Elvis Presley was standing near the front of the stage, talking to his band members. He wasn't in his flashy stage clothes, just a simple shirt and trousers, but he still radiated an almost palpable presence. He was focused, engaged, his brow furrowed in concentration as he discussed a particular musical cue. Mitch froze, the heavy cable slipping from his grasp with a soft thud. His eyes were fixed on Elvis, unable to look away. He saw the way Elvis gestured with his hands, the slight lean of his head when he listened, the easy, almost familial way he interacted with his musicians. This was the king, yes. But it was also just a man doing his job, immersed in his craft. And then Elvis turned not directly to Mitch, but slightly to adjust his stance. In that moment, his gaze swept across the stage, scanning, assessing, and for a fraction of a second, his eyes met Mitch's. It was only a glance, brief and impersonal, the kind of look a stranger gives another stranger in a crowded room. But for Mitch, it felt like an electric shock. Those eyes, they were the same. The same deep brown, the same intensity, the same quiet depth. The eyes he'd seen filled with hurt and confusion all those years ago. Mitch instinctively flinched, pulling back slightly as if to make himself smaller. Less visible, he felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of shame wash over him. His stomach churned. He was transported back to the schoolyard, the taste of dust in his mouth, the nervous laughter of his friends. He saw Elvis, a skinny kid, looking up at him, those eyes wide with fear and a quiet dignity that Mitch had never understood. The memory was so vivid, so sharp, it was like a physical blow. Mitch remembered the scuffs on Elvis's worn-out shoes, the faded denim of his overalls, the way he always clutched his schoolbooks tightly to his chest. He remembered the feeling of power when he'd tripped him, sending the books scattering across the dusty ground. He remembered the quiet humiliation in Elvis's eyes as he picked them up, not saying a word, just enduring. And now, here was that same boy grown into a titan, a man who commanded the attention of millions, whose voice could stir souls. And Mitch, the bully, the tormentor, was reduced to a nameless face in the background, hauling cables, his past crimes suddenly screaming in his ears. Quickly averted his gaze, pretending to be intensely focused on the speaker cable. At his feet, his hands were shaking. He felt hot, then cold. He desperately hoped Elvis hadn't recognized him. After all these years, why would he? People change. He was gaunt, his face lined with hardship, his once brawny physique now merely tired. But deep down, a cold dread settled in. He knew with a sickening certainty that some part of him, some subtle gesture or glint in his eye, might just have triggered a flicker of recognition in Elvis. Kind of recognition that isn't forgotten, but rather buried deep, waiting for the right moment to surface. Elvis continued talking to his band, seemingly oblivious to Mitch's internal turmoil. His voice, even in casual conversation, had a soft musical quality. Mitch's listened, half hearing the discussion about a guitar solo, half hearing the echoes of his own cruel laughter from decades ago. He finished positioning the cable, his movements stiff and jerky. He needed to get away to put some distance between himself and the man on stage. He mumbled something to a nearby crew member about needing a wrench and quickly headed towards the wings, his heart still thumping against his ribs. He found a secluded corner backstage near a stack of empty road cases and leaned against the cold metal, trying to steady his breathing. His mind raced. What if Elvis had recognized him? What would he do? Would he call him out? Would he have him thrown out? The thought filled him with a potent cocktail of fear and a strange, almost welcome sense of impending doom. He deserved whatever was coming to him. He knew that. He closed his eyes, picturing the young Elvis, his face earnest, his spirit quiet. And then he pictured the man he had just seen radiating confidence, talent, and an undeniable power. Contrast was stark. A brutal indictment of Mitch's own life choices. He tried to break that boy, tried to dim his light, and all he had done was make his own life dark. A voice, not Elvis's, but a gruff, familiar one, broke through his thoughts. "Mitch, we need you out here. Stop lollygagging." It was Big Mike. He quickly pushed himself off the cases and forced a professional expression onto his face. He nodded. "On my way, Mike." He walked back towards the stage, his gaze carefully avoiding Elvis. He tried to focus on the task at hand, on the heavy equipment, on the complex logistics of putting on a show of this magnitude. But no matter what he did, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking on thin ice, that a tripwire had been set, and that at any moment it could be sprung. The first glimpse had been enough. The recognition, even if only one-sided so far, was a weight on his soul. He was trapped in the past, and the cane was the key to unlocking it. He could almost feel Elvis's eyes on him. Even when they weren't, the confrontation was coming. He could feel it in his bones. The pre-show buzz was electric. Mitch, positioned near the stage entrance, felt the vibrations of the massive crowd gathering outside the arena. He was responsible for checking microphone stands and making sure instruments were correctly placed on the racks before they were wheeled out. It was a simple task, but it kept him busy, kept his mind from dwelling on the inevitable. He had managed to avoid Elvis for the past few days, sticking to the shadows, moving quickly when he knew Elvis was nearby. But he knew his luck couldn't last forever. Tonight, before the show, was the most likely time. Elvis would be making his way to the stage. A small entourage appeared, moving with a controlled urgency. First, a couple of burly security guards, then Colonel Parker, looking like a stout bulldog in a fancy suit. And then Elvis. He was dressed in a shimmering jumpsuit, sparkling with sequins under the backstage lights. His hair was perfectly coiffed, his face a mask of serene focus. He looked like a god, a figure of myth and legend ready to command an army of adoring fans. Mitch felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He was checking a mic stand, his back to the approaching group, pretending to be absorbed in his task. He heard the footsteps growing closer, the low murmur of voices. His heart pounded against his ribs. This was it. "Excuse me." The voice was deep, smooth, resonant. It was Elvis, and he was speaking directly to Mitch. Mitch froze. He slowly turned his blood, turning to ice water. In his veins, he looked up, his eyes meeting Elvis's. For a long moment there was silence, broken only by the distant roar of the crowd. Elvis's eyes, those same deep, soulful eyes, were fixed on Mitch, and this time there was no impersonal glance. There was recognition, cold, hard, undeniable recognition. Mitch saw a flicker in Elvis's eyes, a brief widening, a tightening around the mouth, a subtle shift in his posture. Easy confidence he'd carried moments before was gone, replaced by a guarded stillness. "Mitch?" Elvis's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it cut through the air like a knife. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact layered with a lifetime of memory. Mitch swallowed hard, his throat dry. He couldn't speak, he just nodded. A small, jerky movement. "Yes, sir." He finally managed to croak out the "sir," feeling absurdly out of place. Elvis's lips thinned. He didn't smile. Not even a trace. His gaze was unblinking, analytical, utterly devoid of warmth. It was as if he was looking at a relic from a forgotten, unpleasant past. Well, Elvis said, his voice now flat, devoid of emotion. "Look what the cat dragged in." The words were simple, yet they landed with the force of a physical blow. They weren't angry or loud, but they were chilling in their cold detachment. They implied Mitch was dirt, something unpleasant and unwanted. Mitch flinched. He felt the blood drain from his face. He glanced around, acutely aware of the handful of people nearby. Security guards, Colonel Parker, who were now watching the interaction with curious, unreadable expressions. No one intervened. "Mitch?" Elvis asked, his voice still low, but with an edge of quiet steel. "Are you working for me now?" There was a hint of bitter amusement in his tone, a mockery that Mitch felt deep in his bones. The former bully, now a hired hand for the bullied. The irony was brutal. "Yes, sir," Mitch mumbled, barely audible. "Stagehand?" Elvis took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. Mitch felt himself shrink under the intensity of that stare. "A stagehand, huh?" Elvis's eyes raked over Mitch's worn clothes, his tired face, his rough hands. "Seems like life's been interesting for you." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history, with all the pain and cruelty Mitch had inflicted. It wasn't a question, but a statement, an observation layered with a quiet, devastating judgment. There was no anger, no rage, just a profound, unsettling coldness. It was worse than anger. It was indifference, tinged with a quiet disdain. Mitch felt his stomach clench. He wanted to apologize, to explain, to beg for forgiveness, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? "I'm sorry I made your childhood a living hell. I'm sorry I was a miserable, hateful kid." It all sounded hollow, inadequate. Elvis cut him off, his voice sharper now, though still controlled. "You meant every bit of it. You enjoyed it. You enjoyed making others feel small, didn't you, Mitch?" He took another step, closing the distance between them, his towering presence filling Mitch's vision. "Funny how things turn out, isn't it? The quiet kid, the one you said would never amount to anything standing here, gestured vaguely around the arena, at the vast empty seats waiting to be filled, at the stage shimmering under the lights. And you..." His gaze dropped to Mitch's rough hands, then back to his face. "Still trying to find your footing." The words were not shouted, not aggressive. They were delivered with a quiet precision, each one a perfectly aimed dart striking home. This was not the boy Mitch had known. This was the king, and he was delivering his judgment with an icy calm that was far more devastating than any outburst. Mitch felt tears sting his eyes, a reaction he hadn't had in years. He was humiliated, stripped bare. All his past bravado, all his attempts to forget, to move on, were meaningless. Elvis had remembered, and he hadn't forgotten the pain. Elvis looked at him for another long moment, his expression unreadable, then, slowly, deliberately, turned away. "Get back to your work, Mitch," he said, his voice now dismissive, as if Mitch was no longer even worth his full attention. "And try not to trip over any cables. Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself." He walked past Mitch without another glance, his entourage following silently. Colonel Parker gave Mitch a brief, assessing look, then quickly followed his star. Mitch stood there frozen, the echo of Elvis's words ringing in his ears. "I remember everything. The coldness, the quiet disdain, the utter lack of warmth. It was worse than he could have imagined. He had faced his past, and his past had delivered a perfectly chilling blow. He was just a stagehand, and Elvis was the king. And the gap between them, filled with decades of pain and unspoken resentment, felt wider than the arena itself. His future felt just as cold and bleak as Elvis's words. Mitch didn't remember the rest of the night. His body moved on autopilot, completing his tasks, but his mind was a whirlwind of shame, regret, and the searing memory of Elvis's cold, hard eyes. He felt utterly exposed, as if the dazzling sequins on Elvis's jumpsuit had somehow reflected his own ugliness back at him. He heard the roar of the crowd later that night, the thunderous applause, the incredible power of Elvis's voice filling the arena. He stood in the wings, hidden in the shadows, listening. Each note, each lyric seemed to resonate with a deeper meaning. A painful reminder of the man Elvis had become, despite the obstacles, despite the cruelty of people like Mitch. Elvis moved on stage with a fluidity and confidence that was almost hypnotic, captivated the audience, swaying, gyrating, singing with every fiber of his being. He was pouring his soul out, connecting with thousands of people on a level Mitch couldn't even comprehend. And Mitch, the one who had tried to break that spirit, watched from the dark, a silent witness to a triumph he had once tried to sabotage. When the show ended and the last wave of applause faded, Mitch felt an emptiness settle over him. He helped with the Tepplane lifting equipment, coiling cables, but his movements were mechanical. His mind kept replaying Elvis's words, "I remember everything. You enjoyed it. Funny how things turn out." He deserved it, every single word. The truth of it burrowed deep into his bones. He had reveled in the fear he inspired, in the power he wielded. He hadn't just been thoughtless. He had been deliberately cruel. He had picked on Elvis because he was different, because he was quiet, because he didn't fight back. Because, Mitch now realized, with a sickening clarity, Elvis had possessed a light, a vulnerability that Mitch, in his own insecurity, had felt compelled to try and extinguish. A profound sense of remorse. Not just shame at being called out, but a deep, genuine regret for the pain he had caused. He realized with a sickening clarity that his own life, his own struggles, were a direct result of the kind of person he had chosen to be. He had built his world on small acts of cruelty, and now that world had crumbled, leaving him isolated and alone. He thought about the coldness in Elvis's words. It wasn't hatred, not exactly. It was more like a wall built of self-preservation and a refusal to allow the past to continue to inflict pain. It was a boundary. A clear statement that the boy who was hurt still remembered and would not be easily forgotten. It was a shield, and a necessary one. Mitch felt a knot of something new forming in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just shame, it was a desperate yearning for something different. To undo, to atone, to somehow, impossibly, make things right. He didn't expect forgiveness. He didn't even know if he deserved it. But he knew with a sudden fierce conviction that he couldn't go on living with this weight on his soul. He spent the rest of the night by the river, watching the stars, each one a tiny pinprick of light in the vast darkness. He thought about Elvis, alone in his hotel suite, perhaps still feeling the echoes of the memories Mitch had stirred up. Thought about the courage it must have taken for Elvis to face him, to speak those words, to acknowledge the past without letting it consume him. Mitch had always seen strength in brute force and domination. But tonight he saw a different kind of strength in Elvis. The strength to remember, the strength to heal, and the strength to stand tall despite the shadows of the past. And for the first time in a long time, Mitch felt a flicker of admiration for Elvis, an emotion completely devoid of the jealousy or resentment he might have felt before. Closed his eyes, picturing Elvis on stage bathed in light, singing his heart out. And then he saw the young Elvis, quiet and vulnerable, walking away from Mitch's cruelty, his spirit unbroken. The memory was painful, but it was also a catalyst. Something had to change. Mitch didn't know how or what. But he knew he couldn't just walk away from this encounter and pretend it never happened. He had to face himself just as Elvis had faced him. Coldness was a gift, a painful truth, delivered with precision. And now Mitch finally had to listen. He had to try and build something better from the wreckage of his past. Mitch returned to the arena the next morning feeling a heavy sense of dread. He fully expected to be fired, perhaps even escorted out by security. After the exchange with Elvis, he couldn't imagine anyone wanting him around. He mentally prepared for the inevitable, for Big Mike's gruff dismissal. But Big Mike just nodded at him, handed him a clipboard with a list of tasks, and told him to get to it. No mention of the previous night's encounter. It was as if it hadn't happened. Mitch felt a flicker of surprise, followed by a deeper sense of confusion. Was he invisible, or was Elvis truly that indifferent? He worked through the day, his movements still mechanical, his mind still reeling, kept his head down, avoided eye contact, and tried to disappear into the background. The arena was buzzing with activity, preparing for another night's show. As he was moving some equipment near the main stage, he saw Colonel Parker standing by himself, watching the crew. Mitch tried to slip past unnoticed, but the colonel, a shrewd man known for missing nothing, caught his eye. "You're Mitch, right?" Colonel Parker's voice was surprisingly soft, devoid of the usual bluster. He had a slight, assessing smile on his face, but his eyes were sharp. Mitch froze. "Yes, sir." "Elvis mentioned you," the colonel said, his smile widening almost imperceptibly. "Said you two knew each other from way back." Mitch felt a fresh wave of shame. So Elvis had talked about him. He should have known. He braced himself for a lecture, for a polite but firm dismissal. But Colonel Parker just tilted his head. "You seem like a hard worker, Mitch. Seen you hauling more than your share this week." Mitch blinked, surprised. "Thank you, sir." Colonel's eyes seemed to bore into him, assessing something Mitch couldn't quite decipher. "Elvis had a rough time growing up, you know," he said, his voice casual, almost conversational. "Lots of kids like him in those parts, quiet ones, dreamy ones. Easy targets for the tougher crowd." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "He's a good man, though. Forgave a lot of folks in his life. Moved past a lot of hurts. Made himself into something special, despite it all." Mitch's shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to his scuffed work boots. He couldn't meet the colonel's knowing eyes. It wasn't a direct accusation, but it was clear the colonel knew the history, or at least a version of it. Sometimes the colonel continued, his voice a little softer. "Now, folks from the past show up. And sometimes they're still carrying burdens. Elvis, he carries his own, but he doesn't carry grudges." Not fondly looked up, his eyes meeting the colonel's. He saw not judgment, but a strange kind of understanding, an almost paternal weariness. "He said you were still here," the colonel said, changing the subject slightly. "You didn't run off." Mitch shrugged, a desperate hope fluttering in his chest. I needed the work, sir." "It was only part of the truth, of course," the colonel nodded slowly. "Right. Well, we could use strong hands like yours for the rest of the tour. We're heading out next week. A few more cities. You interested in staying on?" Mitch's jaw dropped. The rest of the tour. That meant weeks. Chance to escape his dismal apartment, his hand-to-mouth existence. A chance to what? To prove himself, to atone. "Yes, sir." Mitch blurted out the words, tumbling out before he could think. "Yes, I am. Very interested." Colonel Parker smiled. A small, genuine smile this time. "Good. We're always looking for reliable people. Just try to stay out of trouble, Mitch. We don't need any unnecessary drama." His eyes twinkled for a moment, and Mitch realized the colonel had just given him a very clear, very specific warning, cloaked in an offer of kindness. He was being given a chance, but it came with an unspoken understanding. "Don't mess up. Don't cause trouble for Elvis." "I won't, sir, I promise." Mitch meant it with every fiber of his being. Colonel nodded, then turned and walked away, leaving Mitch standing there, a mix of disbelief and relief washing over him. He hadn't been fired. He hadn't been kicked out. He had been given an opportunity, a lifeline by the very people he had wronged. He looked across the stage towards the empty space where Elvis would soon stand. Coldness from last night was still a fresh wound, but the colonel's words, his unexpected offer, were a small, fragile balm. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, maybe never, but it was a chance. A chance to show through actions that he wasn't the same person he used to be. Chance to simply exist in Elvis's orbit, to observe, to understand, and perhaps to find some quiet path towards his own redemption. This was a glimmer of hope he hadn't anticipated. It was an unexpected hand, reaching out, not to pull him up, but to give him a rung, to climb on his own. It was an opportunity to be near the man he had wronged, not as a threat, but as a silent, humble presence. It was a chance to prove to himself more than anyone else that he could be different. The long road of atonement had just opened up, and Mitch, for the first time in a long time, felt a flicker of purpose beyond mere survival. The tour began a few days later, a whirlwind of travel set up in Tep. Mitch found himself on a bus, then a train, then another bus, moving from city to city, arena to arena. The work was still demanding, physically exhausting, but the constant motion and the focused tasks kept his mind occupied. He stuck to his promise to Colonel Parker. He worked harder than anyone else, volunteering for extra shifts, taking on the dirtiest jobs. He was quiet, efficient, and reliable. He became a ghost in the background, a part of the crew, almost invisible. From his vantage point, often in the wings or backstage, Mitch watched Elvis. He saw him in different lights, under different pressures. He saw the transformation from the quiet, almost reserved man off stage to the electrifying performer who owned every single moment in front of an audience. He saw Elvis interact with his bandmates, often with a casual camaraderie, a shared laugh, a professional respect. He saw him sign autographs for hundreds of fans, patiently, kindly, despite the obvious fatigue. He saw him give quick, heartfelt instructions to his musicians, always focused on delivering the best possible show. Mitch noticed the small details. The way Elvis would sometimes pace nervously before a show, a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes that would vanish the moment he stepped into the light. The incredible physical toll of performing, the sweat, the exertion, yet the unwavering energy he projected to the crowd. He saw the immense pressure Elvis was under, the constant demands on his time, his voice, his very being. He saw the crowds, a sea of faces stretching into the distance, screaming his name, holding up signs, reaching out for a touch. The sheer adoration was overwhelming, almost frightening in its intensity. And Elvis handled it all, night after night, with a grace and professionalism that Mitch found truly astonishing. Picture Mitch had carried of Elvis, the quiet, easily intimidated kid, slowly began to crack, replaced by a much more complex and powerful image. Elvis wasn't just a performer, he was a phenomenon. But beneath the dazzling exterior, Mitch began to see the human being, the dedication, the passion, and yes, the lingering echoes of the quiet boy who had learned to channel his inner world into something truly extraordinary. Mitch found himself thinking about Elvis's early life, about his own past actions, but now with a different lens. He realized that the quietness he had once mocked was not a weakness, but a wellspring of deep emotion. The awkwardness he had exploited was just a shell, hiding a profound artistry. Every time Elvis poured his heart out on stage, Mitch felt a pang of a strange new emotion, admiration. He never approached Elvis again, kept his distance, knowing that the ice-cold words were still hanging in the air, a constant reminder of the past. He didn't expect a sudden change of heart from Elvis. He didn't even know if he deserved one. But being on the tour, witnessing this incredible force of nature up close, was slowly transforming Mitch. He stopped feeling angry at his own life's failures. He stopped blaming others. He started to see that his own choices, his own bitterness, had led him to where he was. And Elvis, the one he had tried to diminish, had found a way to rise above, not by dominating others, but by embracing his own unique gifts. One evening, during a sound check, Mitch was on stage, adjusting a microphone, when Elvis walked out, casually strumming a guitar. He wasn't in his stage clothes, just a simple denim jacket and jeans. He looked relaxed, almost boyish. He hummed a tune. Testing the mic, Mitch froze. Ready to mic. Mitch fro needs fro me she. It wasn't a welcome, not an invitation, but it wasn't a dismissal either. It was just seeing. Mitch felt a strange warmth spread through him. It was a tiny thing, just a nod, but it felt significant. It wasn't the searing judgment of their last encounter, but a quiet, almost neutral recognition. It was as if Elvis was saying, "I see you, you're still here, you're doing your job." It was enough. It was a crack in the ice, a tiny fissure that let in a sliver of light. It reinforced Mitch's resolve to continue. He wasn't seeking forgiveness, not directly, but he was seeking to prove to himself that he could be a better man, a reliable man, a quiet presence that wasn't a threat, continued to watch, to learn, to absorb the atmosphere of creation and performance. He saw the human toll, the exhaustion, the demands, but also the deep satisfaction that came from touching so many lives. And as he watched, Mitch began to understand that true power wasn't about hurting others, but about elevating them, about bringing joy and beauty into the world. It was a lesson he was only now beginning to learn, taught to him ironically by the boy he had once tried to crush. The path was long, but he was walking it, step by painful, hopeful step. The tour rolled on, city after city. Mitch found a rhythm in the constant movement, the routine of setting up and tearing down. His muscles ached, but his mind felt clearer than it had in years. The shame was still there, a constant companion, but it was now laced with a growing resolve. He wanted to do something. Something to make amends, however small, however unacknowledged. He kept his ears open, listening to the crew, observing the daily challenges of a massive touring production. He looked for opportunities, not for recognition, but for quiet acts of service, little ways to make things smoother, easier, for the team and perhaps for Elvis. One afternoon, during a particularly chaotic sound check, a crucial piece of equipment, a spacious microphone stand that Elvis favored, got bent out of shape. Panic flared among the sound engineers. The spare was still hours away. Mitch, who had a knack for tinkering and a lifetime of fixing things out of necessity, saw the problem. Quietly took the damaged stand, moved to a corner and began to examine it. He didn't announce his intentions. He just started working. He pulled out a small set of tools he always carried, remnants of his old life, of fixing his own broken-down truck or leaky pipes. He worked patiently, carefully, bending the metal back into shape, tightening a loose joint, ensuring the delicate mechanisms were aligned. His hands, usually used for brute force, moved with surprising dexterity. After about 20 minutes, he tested it. It was still a little stiff, but it was perfectly functional. He carried it back, placing it quietly where it belonged. A few minutes later, the lead sound engineer, a harried man named Ray, walked over. His face etched with worry, he picked up the stand, tested it, and his eyes widened. "It's fixed. Who? How did this happen?" He looked around, bewildered. Mitch was already walking away, heading towards another task, pretending he hadn't heard. He felt a small, unfamiliar flicker of satisfaction, a quiet sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with power or control. Another time, he noticed one of the roadies, a young kid named Sammy, struggling with a particularly heavy amplifier. Sammy was thin, not as strong as the others, and he looked exhausted. Mitch, without a word, walked over and simply picked up the other end of the amplifier, helping Sammy lift it onto the truck. Sammy looked at him, surprised, then offered a grateful nod. Mitch just nodded back, then moved on. These were small things, almost invisible acts of kindness or quiet competence. He wasn't looking for praise, he wasn't trying to earn points. He was simply trying to contribute, to be useful, to be a positive presence rather than a negative one. He was trying to be the opposite of the kid he once was. He even started looking out for Elvis's personal needs, though always from a distance. One morning, he noticed Elvis's limousine parked in an awkward spot right in the blazing sun before a long drive. Mitch knew the car would be stifling by the time Elvis got in. Without a second thought, he quietly moved a large sunshade, usually used for equipment, and angled it to block the sun from the car's windows. No one saw him. No one needed to. He wasn't trying to manipulate Elvis, or even to win him over. He was simply trying to change himself one small, selfless act at a time. He was trying to chip away at the mountain of guilt he carried to build a different foundation for himself. He found a strange kind of peace in these anonymous efforts. It was a quiet form of penance, a way of proving to himself that he could be more than just the bully from Tupelo. He knew Elvis was a busy man surrounded by a large team. It was unlikely he would notice these small actions, but Mitch didn't do them for Elvis's notice. He did them for himself, for the quiet boy who still lived inside the king, for the pain he had caused, and for the hope of finding his own redemption. Still, a part of him wondered, did any of it matter? Did any of his quiet efforts filter up to the man who carried such a clear memory of Mitch's past? Or was the ice between them too thick, too deeply rooted to ever truly melt? He didn't know, and he didn't expect it to. But the act of trying, the quiet daily effort, was, in itself, a transformation. And that was enough, for now the tour was nearing its end. Mitch had been with the crew for weeks now, a quiet, dependable presence. He had settled into the routine, and the constant travel, the hard work, even the lingering shame, had begun to feel normal. He no longer felt that gnawing anxiety about his next meal or his rent. He had purpose, albeit a quiet, anonymous one. He was backstage, securing a ramp after a particularly energetic show, when he heard footsteps approach. He didn't look up immediately, assuming it was another crew member, Mitch. The voice was unmistakably Elvis's. It was soft, not the commanding stage voice, but it was clear and direct. Mitch's heart leaped into his throat. He slowly straightened up, turning to face Elvis. Elvis was still in his shimmering jumpsuit, a towel around his neck, looking tired but exhilarated from the performance. His eyes, though still holding that deep, knowing gaze, seemed different tonight. Less guarded, perhaps. Or perhaps Mitch was just seeing them differently. "Yes, sir." Mitch managed, his voice a little hoarse. He braced himself. Had he done something wrong? Had his past finally caught up to him again, in full force? Elvis continued, his gaze unwavering. "And the sunshade for the car this morning." Mitch felt a flush creep up his neck. He hadn't thought Elvis. "Just doing my job, sir." Elvis gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "No, Mitch, that's not just doing your job, that's looking out. That's being helpful." He paused, and a small, thoughtful silence settled between them. The sound of distant chatter and equipment being moved was the only backdrop. "Why are you doing that, Mitch?" Elvis asked, his voice low, a hint of curiosity in his tone, not accusatory, not cold, but genuinely curious. "Why are you still here?" Mitch felt a lump form in his throat. This was it. The moment of truth. He had prepared for this, in a way, for weeks. But now, with Elvis standing right in front of him, the words seemed to catch in his throat. He took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "Sir Elvis," he started, his voice barely above a whisper. I know what I did, back in Tupelo to you. I've remembered it every day since you looked at me like that first night." He gestured vaguely, remembering the ice-cold words. Elvis's expression remained unreadable, but he didn't interrupt. He just listened. I was a rotten kid," Elvis Mitch continued, the words, now flowing raw and unfiltered. "A bully. I made your life miserable. I made a lot of kids' lives miserable. I thought it made me strong, big. But it just made me small and empty." He swallowed hard, feeling the sting of tears in his eyes again. "And when I saw you that first day and you looked at me, I knew you remembered, and I deserved every single word you said, every single one." He looked Elvis directly in the eye, baring his soul. "I'm not asking you to forgive me, Elvis. I don't deserve it. Not for what I did. I just wanted you to know that I'm not that kid anymore. I'm really trying to be different, and seeing what you've become, it's made me see things about my Mitch felt a profound relief as the words spilled out, years of buried shame and regret finally seeing the light. He stood there, exposed, vulnerable, waiting for Elvis's reaction. He expected anger, or perhaps even a final dismissive coldness. Elvis listened, his face impassive for a long moment. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rigidity in his shoulders seemed to ease. A deep sigh escaped his lips. "It wasn't just kid stuff," Mitch Elvis said, his voice soft, almost weary. It hurt. It hurt a lot, and for a long time." His gaze was distant for a moment, as if he was looking back into that painful past. Mitch nodded, his eyes downcast. I know now, and I'm truly deeply sorry for it, Elvis. More than words can say." Elvis was silent again. Then he stepped closer, surprisingly close. Mitch instinctively tensed, but Elvis simply reached out a hand, not to Mitch, but to the mech stand Mitch had fixed earlier. He ran his fingers over the repaired joint, then looked at Mitch. "People can change, Mitch," Elvis said, his voice quiet, almost reflective. "Past, it's always a part of you. You carry it, and so do the people you touched." He looked Mitch squarely in the eye. "What you did, it helped shape me too. Made me stronger in some ways, made me want to prove them all wrong." He paused. "You were one of them, Mitch." Mitch flinched, but he didn't argue. "It was the truth." "But," Elvis continued, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly, "what you're doing now, these things you're doing for the crew, for this tour, that's changing things too, isn't it?" Mitch looked up, a glimmer of hope, fragile but real, stirring within him. "I hope so, sir. I'm trying." Elvis held his gaze for a moment longer, a subtle shift in the air between them. The ice, though still present, felt thinner, perhaps even translucent. It wasn't a full thaw, but it was a crucial, undeniable shift. He wasn't just the memory of a bully anymore, he was Mitch, the person trying to change. The silence that followed Elvis's words felt different this time. Not cold and condemning, but thoughtful, almost contemplative. Mitch felt a profound sense of relief, a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he was carrying until that very moment. He had spoken his truth, bared his soul, and Elvis had listened. He hadn't been dismissed, nor had he been granted immediate, easy forgiveness. He had simply been seen. Elvis finally broke the silence, his voice still quiet, but with a surprising gentleness. "It takes courage, Mitch," he said, "to face yourself, to look at what you did and say it out loud. Most folks never do that." He paused, his gaze fixed on Mitch's face, searching. "I see you're trying, and that means something." Mitch felt a warmth spread through his chest, replacing the lingering chill of the past. It wasn't the full embrace of forgiveness, not a declaration of friendship. It was something deeper, something more earned. It was an acknowledgement of his effort, a recognition of his struggle. "Thank you," Elvis, Mitch mumbled, his voice thick with emotion. It means everything." Elvis gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "The road's long, Mitch," he said, a faint, almost melancholic smile touching his lips. "For all of us. But it looks like you're finally on the right path." He looked around the bustling backstage area, then back at Mitch. "Keep doing what you're doing, keep being useful, keep being that kind of man." He didn't offer a hand for Mitch to shake. There was no grand gesture. Their shared past, the wounds and the memories, were too profound for a simple handshake to erase. But the words themselves were a gift, a validation that Mitch had never expected. Elvis then gave Mitch a final long look, a complex mix of memory, understanding, and perhaps even a hint of respect in his eyes. Then, with a subtle nod, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the flurry of activity as he made his way to his dressing room. Colonel Parker, who had been standing a respectful distance away, gave Mitch a brief, almost imperceptible wink as he followed Elvis. Mitch stood there for a long moment, the sounds of the arena fading into the background of his own thoughts. He felt exhausted, but not from physical labor. Exhausted from the emotional weight that had finally begun to lift. He had been judged. Yes, but he had also been seen, acknowledged, and in a quiet, profound way given a chance. He didn't know what the future held. He would finish the tour, continue working hard, continue to be useful. He wouldn't expect anything more from Elvis or from life, but he carried a new feeling inside him, a sense of quiet purpose that had been absent for decades. The shame hadn't vanished entirely, but it no longer defined him. It was now a reminder, a lesson learned, etched into his very being. Over the next few days, as the tour wrapped up, Mitch continued his quiet work. He maintained his distance from Elvis, but now when their paths occasionally crossed, There was a subtle difference. Elvis would sometimes offer a brief nod or a fleeting, almost imperceptible smile. No words were exchanged, but the silence was no longer cold. It was a silence of understanding, of a shared, complicated history that had finally found a fragile peace. When the last show was done, and the arena was mostly empty, Mitch packed his meager belongings. He said goodbye to Big Mike, who gave him a rare, gruff nod of approval, and to Sammy, who clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Thanks for everything, Mitch. You're a good guy." Mitch was walking out of the arena, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, when he heard a voice call his name. He turned. It was one of Elvis's personal assistants, a young woman with a kind smile. "Mitch," she said, holding out a small, folded envelope. "Mr. Presley asked me to give you this." Mitch took the envelope, his heart doing a strange flutter. He looked at her, confused. "He just said it was a little something extra," she replied, her smile gentle, "and that he wished you well." She gave him a final, knowing look, then turned and walked away. Mitch stood there staring at the envelope. He slowly opened it. Inside was a crisp wad of cash, far more than he was owed for his work on the tour, and tucked beneath it a small, handwritten note. The handwriting was unmistakably Elvis's, a quick flowing script. "Mitch, keep walking that path. You got good in you, EP." Mitch felt a rush of emotion so powerful it almost buckled his knees. He gripped the note, his vision blurring. It wasn't a full pardon, not a forgotten past, but it was an acknowledgement, a sign, a silent blessing from the man he had wronged. He looked around the empty arena, the vast space that had once echoed with his cruelty, and now hummed with the ghosts of triumph and a quiet, unexpected grace. He didn't know what he would do next, but he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't squander this chance. He wouldn't go back to the bitter, angry man he used to be. He tucked the money and the note safely into his pocket. The air still carried the faint scent of stale popcorn and triumph. Mitch took a deep breath. The coldness finally gone from his own heart, replaced by a quiet, burgeoning hope. He had faced the king, faced his past, and found a glimmer of redemption in the cold, hard truth. And it was unexpectedly the warmest feeling he had felt in a very long time. He walked out of the arena, not as a broken man, but as a man finally ready to rebuild. His journey of atonement had truly begun.